In this video, you'll learn how to use the near-infrared detector for the Horiba LabRAM Raman microscope at the Molecular Foundry. The near-infrared detector is a Horiba Symphony 2 InGas or IGA detector. It's a linear 512 pixel array detector that operates between 800 and 1700 nanometers. It's liquid nitrogen cooled, and you can see the doer on the left side of the microscope. This is an overview for using the near-infrared detector. We'll start by turning on the detector and then adding liquid nitrogen to cool it down to operating temperature. We'll switch the software settings, then we'll wait for the detector to cool. Finally, we'll use the detector and then return the microscope back to its standard settings for visible detection. To turn the detector on, you're first going to start about 1 hour before using the detector so that you allow time for cooling. You turn on the detector by going to the near-infrared detector power supply below the optical bench. The switch is actually behind the detector, so you have to crawl down there and reach behind the detector. Most of the time we leave these two detectors on, so there shouldn't be any need to actually turn it on, but make sure the LED for the second or bottom power supply is turned on before you proceed. It's very important that you add liquid nitrogen only if the power supply is on. That's because the temperature control of the power supply keeps components from inside the detector from cracking. So therefore you have to be sure that the power supply is on before you proceed to the next step. To cool the near-infrared detector, which reduces the noise in the detector, you're going to first fill a portable dewar full of liquid nitrogen. So you do this in the Molecular Foundry down on the first floor outside. You must be cryo-trained and trained on the job by a staff member. Remember to use the appropriate PPE, including cryo gloves and safety glasses, whenever you transfer liquid nitrogen. Again, make sure the near-infrared power supply is on before you add liquid nitrogen. So the first thing you're going to do is add a small amount of liquid nitrogen to the dewar, and most of this nitrogen will evaporate, but it will pre-cool the detector. So after about 5 minutes, you can add the rest of the liquid nitrogen. This will actually cool the detector for over 12 hours. So while you're waiting for the detector to cool down, you can go into the LabSpec software and start changing some of the settings so that they are configured for infrared detection. So the first thing you're going to do is to change the detector. You actually toggle this button at the bottom of the LabSpec window so that it actually says Synapse IGA, which stands for the InGas detector. So when the detector is too hot or above its operating temperature, the icon that you click will be orange. You can see the temperature of the detector with the number next to the orange icon, and eventually it will reach about negative 100 degrees Celsius and the detector icon will appear blue. So the next thing we'll do is switch the shutter to the near-infrared detector. So this is a hardware shutter on the left side of the Raman microscope. And you can see that if you want to use the near-infrared detector, you should switch the shutter switch down to shutter 2. So there's a handy label next to the shutter that actually reminds you of which direction the shutter should go. It's important to switch the shutter switch because the near-infrared detector needs to be able to synchronize with the shutter. So the next thing we'll do is to change the microscope options. Here, these are all optional. You can play around with them to see if they improve your signal to noise. Generally, they don't really change it that much. So one of the options, which you can access by clicking the instrument setup button in the main LabSpec window, is the UV IR light path. So this really is only important if you're going deep into the IR around 1500 nanometers. There's also the detector button here, and so this is equivalent to what we did before with the icon toggling. So you don't have to use this, but if you wanted to, you can click on this radio button to switch to the IGA detector. If you're measuring on the longer end of the infrared detector range, say around 1400 or 1500 nanometers, you may want to use an objective that's dedicated to the near infrared. That's because the transmission of the visible objectives in the infrared region is not very high. So we have a 100x near infrared objective that you can check out from the super users. So once you've set up the infrared detector settings, you have to wait for about an hour before the detector temperature stabilizes below 100 degrees Celsius. You would then use the microscope as you normally would, following the manual or the videos. The detector actually can remain cool for a very long time, overnight or even 24 hours. So you don't have to worry too much about the detector warming up, but if the temperature starts to warm up, then you would just add more liquid nitrogen. When you're done using the near infrared detector, like everything else on the microscope, you want to set the configuration back to the standard configuration. In this case, this would be the visible detector. So you would click again on the detector icon on the bottom of the LabSpec window and switch it to the Synapse CCD. And if you set any of the light path options, you would set it back to the visible light path. And if you set the microscope objective to the infrared objective, then you would swap that back for the original visible objective. Again, you would switch the shutter manually back to the visible shutter. That's really important because anyone who doesn't know about that shutter switch will not be able to take spectra. And then, importantly, you would leave the near infrared power supply on. That's because it will still have liquid nitrogen in it. And remember, you always want to have the power supply on when you have liquid nitrogen in it. So the liquid nitrogen will naturally just boil off over time. And we always leave the infrared power supply on. So it generally is not a problem. So you can just walk away. Finally, you would follow any of the other standard microscope shutdown routines, including turning off the lasers and the lamp. So that is using the near infrared detector. Again, the standard operating procedure is to turn on the detector power supply, cool it down with nitrogen, switch the detector and other microscope options, wait for the detector to cool, use it, and then return everything to standard settings. If you have any other questions, ask the Raman microscope administrator or any other super users. And remember that you can find the standard microscope usage manual and training video on the oliver.lbl.gov website.